Good evening. Welcome to Critical Witness. I'm Phil, and I'm here with Dan, as usual, and Andy Bannister. And we've got about an hour with Andy, so we're going to go straight into our conversation without any little blurb at the start. So, hi, Andy. Great to...
Hey, Phil. Hey, Dan. How you doing? Happy birthday, man. You've got happy birthday behind you, so...
Yes.
And the shirt. The shirt is...
It's a lovely shirt. It's a
lovely
lovely
shirt. Blends in with the birthday banner.
I love a good bright.
I've read about this, that lockdown sort of makes people's heads go funny, and they start, wearing leery shirts and various other things.
It seems to be the case.
I need something to bring a little joy to my life.
Absolutely.
And a bit of colour. So I'm looking forward to getting on the train with it when I'm back to work.
Were you going to the train with that shirt?
Absolutely, shorts, trainers, and a nice bright Hawaiian shirt. That's one of my favourite ways.
Flip flops with socks.
That's it. Yeah, like a true Christian, just like Jesus would.
I love how this is started. We're already there.
What would Jesus wear?
What would Jesus wear? I know. I was going to ask. Let's get straight into this.
Straight in.
You have written a book about Muslims and Christians. So I guess before we get started into that, did you see recently? I think it was this week that a Malaysian Christian won a case in the Malaysian High Court, basically saying she won the right to refer to God as Allah, as a Christian. It's my understanding that quite a few Arabic Christians around the world do use the term Allah to refer to God in the Christian sense. So does that mean actually we do? What does that mean? Is it okay for Christians, you think, to refer to God as Allah, or does that infer muddy the waters in regards? Is it is the same God?
Dan. Great question. So you're right about the timing on the Malaysian piece, and I was encouraged to see that, because for a long time, Malaysian Christians have been fighting that, and their argument, and the argument of other sort of Christians in that region, has been that actually Christians were using the word Allah to refer to God. If in some sense before Islam came along, actually it's just there is a sense in which it is just the Arabic word for God. By the time you get to the Quran, it sort of now begins becoming more of God's proper name within the Quran. But certainly, I think before Islam, it was a kind of generic term. So why the heck shouldn't Christians be able to use it? And in a sense, I think in terms of Muslim-Christian dialogue, the whole argument of my book, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God, is not so much about what word we use to refer to God. It's about the question of who is God and what is God like? Because God is one of those words that we throw around quite sloppily. We do it here in the West. You say as a Christian, I believe in God. Your atheist friend says, I don't believe in God. But we're assuming that we're referring to the same thing. And one of the things I say in the book is just we need to stop and pause and say, okay, when you talk about God, what do we mean? And so when our Muslim friends use the word Allah, or when Christians and Arabic speakers use the same term or choose a different term, and we as British English speakers use the word God, what do we mean? And now I find in Muslim Christian dialogue, I tend to stay away from the term Allah for obvious reasons. I'm an English speaker, but also I think it does help bring clarity. And so one of the things in the book I do a little bit is I tend to when I talk about the God of the Bible, I tend to use God's biblical name, Yahweh, from the Old Testament there. And when I talk about the God of the Quran, I tend to use Allah, just so we make people pause and think about the fact that actually we potentially have two different characters and two different entities here. And if we end up concluding they're the same, sure, so be it. But don't assume they're the same. I think that's perhaps the big starting point of the book, is we have to ask what we mean by the words that we use.
All right, well, let's kind of start there then. So just a brief overview would be interesting of Yahweh, Allah. Is it I guess you've written a book on it. It's not as straightforward as just like, maybe we should define the Christian God very quickly before we go into Islam, if you'd be happy to do that.
In fact, what I'll do, Phil, if it's okay, let me just back up slightly before there. One of the things I do in the book is I offer a framework in the book to help people talk about different religions and also talk about no religion, framework, so we can actually begin sort of dialoguing together. And the framework I offer, which is not unique to me, I've modified it from others, is to say, look, there are four great questions, four great worldview questions that we can use as Christian as in dialogue. We can ask, the person we're talking with, do you think there's a God? And if so, what is God like? We can ask, what do you think human beings are? We can ask the question, what do you think's gone wrong with the world? And we can ask the question, what's the solution to that? And that's a great fourfold talking point for if Christians and Muslims are dialoguing, or if Christians and atheists are dialoguing. And therefore, in the book, what I then do in terms of the Muslim piece of this is start with that first of those worldview questions. Okay, is there a God? And of course, Muslims and Christians say, yes, absolutely, we believe there's a God. Okay, what is God like? And then I go on in the fourth chapter of the book to say that, look, I think the God of the Bible, there are many ways we could define God. But if you look at themes that run through our Old and New Testament and are pretty universal across 1400 years of biblical scripture, of biblical texts, we see that the God of the Bible is a God who's relational. He's a God who walks and talks with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. He's a God who, appears to Moses at the burning bush. He's a God who is there present in the wilderness with his people in the pillar of fire and the cloud of smoke. He's a God who turns up time and time again. He's a God who walks and talks with redeemed humanity in the new heavens and the new earth. And he's the God who stepped into history in the person of Jesus. So he's a God who's relational. He's a God who can be known. Again, that's the theme that runs through Old and New Testament. Again, summer, really reaches its zenith in the person of Jesus. The whole invitation of the Bible is not just to know about God, but to know God. He's a God who reveals himself, not just his commands. He's also a God who is holy. That's a theme that runs through the whole of the Bible. God is too holy to even look on evil. He doesn't just merely sort of disapprove of human sin. He's a God who is so holy and so good and so righteous and so pure that he can't even tolerate sin in his presence. Fourthly, he's a God who is love. The Bible stresses that again in both Old and New Testaments, that God is at his very heart of his identity, a God who is love. And then fifthly, I'm going to sneeze in a minute, by the way, just to warn you. Excuse me. Just to make it dramatic. Drum roll.
That's the fifth one, is it? Just
the fifth one is, yes, God is God who suffered. And I think we see that in both Old and New Testaments, actually, that God is grieved by human sin. In the Old Testament, he doesn't just merely disapprove. It actually breaks the heart of God. I think it's the kind of language the New Testament, Old Testament almost uses in places. And in the New Testament, we see that in the person of Christ. So relational, knowable, holy, love, suffered. And then basically what we do is we, in the book, then turn over to the Quran and explore each of those themes and see how actually the Quran outrightly rejects or ignores or sidelines all five of them. They are really not part of the Quran's picture of Allah. In fact, quite the opposite is the case.
So, by that, so is it actively against? And from what I've seen in my interactions with the Quran, and it's not just it's their prayers. It's even down to their daily prayers that it completely undermines the Christian concept of God. Or is it just Jesus in the daily prayers that they undermine?
Yeah, it's a Christian Phil. I mean, here's the thing. Sometimes. What's been interesting is, as word has got out on social media, the book is out. It came out a week ago, so we're still fairly kind of hot off the press. So watching some reception, and one of the things that I've been intrigued by is a number of Christians on social media who will jump on to my, Facebook or Instagram or Twitter post about the book, and seeing the title will go no, it's obvious, isn't it? The answer is no. To which I often like to say, well, yeah, that's a perfectly acceptable one-word answer. But what do you say to someone who says, why is it no? And then often Christians go straight for Jesus. Well, the answer is Jesus. It's like the old Sunday school answer. What's little boy who was asked, what's grey, has a bushy tail and eats nuts? Well, it sounds like a squirrel to me, but I know the answer is Jesus. Jesus is often the right answer. But we sometimes get there too quickly. And I always say to people on this issue, if we say the defining difference between Christians and Muslims is Jesus, that's great. But we then end up, we risk disenfranchising our Muslim friends, our Jewish friends. I don't think as Christians we want to be saying, our Jewish friends don't worship the same God as we do, or the gods, the God that Abraham or Moses or Isaac kind of worshipped, somehow wasn't the God of the Bible. But if you grabbed Abraham, sort of 1500 years, 2000 years BC, whatever, and gone, hey, do you know the name Jesus? He'd gone, who? But if you look at the Old Testament, to go all those characteristics, a God who's relational, knowable, love, holy, love, has suffered. They are all themes that are there in the Old Testament. They're all themes that those Old Testament figures would have understood and recognized. They're all themes that are central to Judaism, and they are all themes that are seen there most clearly in Jesus, because Jesus is what God looks like, the God of the Old Testament looks like when he steps into history. And so Jesus is the end of the story. But I think sometimes as Christians we need to wind the clock back a little bit, and this is also helpful with Muslims, because Muslims sometimes have a tendency to try and sort of sideline Jesus and go, well, yeah, but the Trinity, blah blah blah, whatever. And I go, well, just put Jesus to one side for a moment, and let's talk about the Old Testament, where Muslims actually don't often go, and let's look at the characteristic of God there. And what's also fascinating is the Quran often borrows stories from the Old Testament and deeply subverts them in the process. To give you just one very quick example, it's a beautiful story, amazing story in Genesis 15, amazing story of God's relationality, where God is forming a covenant with Abraham, this binding promise to commit to Abraham and his family, and they do what's called a covenant cutting ceremony. That's what you did in the ancient Near East. And when you form a covenant, both parties would take some animals, would cut them in two, lay the pieces aside each other, and both parties would walk through the line of cut animals. And the symbolism simply said, if one either of us breaks the terms of this agreement, may we be like these animals, literally torn apart. And it's amazing that you read that in Genesis 15. Abraham doesn't do the walking. God, in the shape of a burning brazier, goes through between those two lines of cut pieces. God basically saying, I will commit myself to this covenant cutting ceremony. I will be the one who bears the consequences of what happens if this is broken. And of course, that's ultimately fulfilled in Jesus and the New Testament. Well, the Quran takes this story in Genesis 15, this amazing story of God relating and making himself known in this incredible way to Abraham. The Quran borrows it 700 years later, more than 700 years later, actually over 1,000 years later, doesn't know what to do with it, and turns it in the Quran into this bizarre little story about Allah telling Abraham to cut some animals in two, put the pieces on different mountains, and then sort of say a prayer, and Allah will rejoin the pieces and raise the creatures from the dead. And it's this bizarre little parable about resurrection. And the Quran just totally misses the whole point of that story. And in retelling, it doesn't just mangle the story, mangle the theology. It also loses that incredible insight into who God is and how he relates to human beings. And the Quran does that time and time again, particularly with the Old Testament material.
That's really interesting, because we share a lot of prophets. So when you're talking about Jews just then, you're saying, well, you've got Abraham, Moses, and all the prophets. And so we'd be very wary of jumping straight to Jesus and saying Jews and Christians worship a different God. But just playing the ignorant one here, Muslims make the same argument that they share the prophets, that Abraham was a Muslim, that Moses, all of them would be Muslims. So just sort of to dig into that further, not just Genesis 15, how then would you make a different argument if you're talking to a Jew than from a Muslim?
Well, a couple of things going on. If I was talking to a Jewish friend, obviously I'd start with the Old Testament, and I'd say, let's have a look at the nature and the character of God. Let's look at many of the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, and let's talk about how they relate to and point forward to Jesus, and I have that conversation. With Muslims, and this is a crucial thing, actually, Phil, that I go into in the 8th chapter of the book, is that one of the big problems that has confused Christian-Muslim dialogue, arguably for centuries, actually, is that Christians have come along and we've looked at the Quran and we've gone, oh, it talks about Abraham, it talks about Isaac, it talks about Moses and so on. Therefore, in some sense, it's sort of cut from the same cloth as the Old Testament. Even your language there, we share these things in common. But there's been a lot more recent work done on this. In fact, the book that really has made massive inroads into this in the last few years is Mark Dury's book, The Quran and Its Biblical Reflexes. And Mark's interesting because he's a Quranic expert and he's a linguist. And he talks about the fact in linguistics, there's a big difference between when things are borrowed or things are inherited. So in language, sometimes words are inherited. So, for example, English, is one of the European languages. It's ultimately a Romance language. It goes back into French and into the other European languages, and obviously the Anglo-Saxon there as well. But you can trace the heritage back. We have lots of words in English that have been inherited through things like French and Latin and so forth, as the continuity. We also have words that English has borrowed. Take the word juggernaut, for example. The word juggernaut was originally the name of a Hindu deity, and who was worshipped by the devotees, building these great kind of wooden chariots and rolling them over devotees and crushing people to death. And it was a Hindu deity, I think, called Jagannatha. And that eventually got borrowed, through the Brits' involvement in India and came into the modern word juggernauts. But the modern word juggernauts, has no connection to Hindu worship. When you say, the next podcast recording came down the road like a juggernaut, you're not making any implications about planning to start, crushing your guests on the wheeled wooden chariots, or a desire to embrace forms of Hinduism, because that word's been borrowed with no regard to its context. And borrowing destroys context. Inheritance brings context over. And Mark's argument and others is when you look at the Quran, what we have is borrowing. The Quran has picked up the name of Abraham. It's picked up the name of Moses and some of the stories that were sloshing around the Middle East of Muhammad's day. And it's borrowed them, inserted them into an entirely new context, and then lost the meaning in the process. And so it's not that the Quran is Islam is an Abrahamic faith, or Muslims and Christians share these prophets in common. Rather, we have a very, very different Arabian faith that's borrowed a few words and sort of inserted them into places. But we get completely confused, discombobulated, if we therefore think, okay, there's some sort of theological connection here. And so I mapped that out in the 8th chapter of the book, try and take Mark's work and the work of others and popularize that so it can be seen. And so, yeah, I think many scholars now of the history of religions would say the term Abrahamic faiths is not a helpful one. Treat Islam as a unique creation in its own context, and treat Judaism and Christianity certainly as sister religions, but don't jam the three together. It just confuses everything.
They also do it with Jesus as well, don't they? With regards to the use of the infancy gospel of Thomas, and other examples as well of pseudo gospels and pseudo books that were sort of around the Arab Peninsula. That's an interesting distinction, I think, because like you said, I had that in my sort of notes about how there is this assumption there is this sort of shared genealogy and heritage because of these terms that we share in common, like Adam, it goes all the way, it talks about Adam as well, Abraham, Moses, so it feels like we have something in common, but like from what you've said, that difference between borrowing and inheriting is actually a really important distinction.
It's a crucial one, Dan. Crucial, yeah.
So what I'd be interested in, I guess what would be helpful is, what's the best case for someone that you would come up against, the best case for Allah and Yahweh really being the same deity, that Christians and Muslims are sort of worshipping the same God. I found a really interesting quote from it was Pope Gregory from the 12th century, who was writing to King Azir, who is the Islamic ruler of Mauritania, and he talks about, when he's speaking to him, he very much says that we believe and confess in one God, although in a different way, and praise and worship him daily as the creator of all ages and the ruler of this world. So it's not something modern. There's clearly, like throughout history, there have been Christians and Muslims who have thought, actually, no, we do it in different ways, but we're really worshipping the same God, just through different motions. Exactly.
No, there's so much in that question, Dan. So let me just sort of try and shed a little bit of light if I can. Just a couple of things. One thing on borrowing and inheritance, and then I'll angle into your piece there. Just another illustration, I think, because this is so crucial, I think, to understanding what's going on with Islam and Christianity and Judaism. The other analogy I use in the book, one of my favorite buildings in the UK is York Minster. If anyone's ever listening to this ever been to York Minster, you'll know it's just this gorgeous, gorgeous cathedral. If you've never been there, Google it, and you can find wonderful pictures online, and virtual reality tours and things. And York Minster is an amazing building because it's a medieval cathedral, but it's built out of what was before. If you go back down through the layers, and in fact you can go to York Minster when it's open after COVID and do what's called the Uncroft tour, and they'll take you down through the foundations. And as you go down through the layers of history beneath York Minster, below the medieval cathedral is a Norman church, The Norman church was built up of a Saxon church, and you can actually see how the two grew out of the earlier ones. And actually, I think on the York Minster website, they've got some fascinating diagrams and so forth, showing you how the Saxon church effectively is turned into a Norman church and then a medieval cathedral. One has inherited from the other, but go right down to the basement. And York Minster was originally built on top of a Roman military installation. It was a Roman military barracks. And when the first church builders of the Saxon church built their first church, they actually took a lot of the old Roman stone and used it in the foundations. In fact, at one point in the foundations of York Minster, there's a pagan Roman altar turned sideways and jammed into the wall because it's a great bit of foundation rubble. And I say in the book, what's the difference between the Roman layer of York Minster and the other three? Well, the other three are all connected. They all inherit from each other. The Norman church inherited from the Saxon church, the medieval cathedral inherited from the other two. There is no continuity with the Roman bits. They're just bits of foundation stone that were useful to the builders. And I think that's going on with the Quran. There's lots of bits of Christian and Jewish theology jammed in there because it worked pretty well. Like Jesus is the case in point. He doesn't really fit in the Quran. We may talk about this in a few minutes. He stands out. He doesn't really work in Quranic theology, but Muhammad kind of picked him up a bit like a bit of Roman stone, jammed it in because there were some good stories there. But you push him to his logical conclusion, it breaks the system. Now, when you come to your question though about the best case for the same God, I think what you end up having to do, you have to end up having a discussion around how big do the differences have to get for it to be different rather than the same. And I talk about this in the book, actually. The book I offer a number of analogies about difference. For example, I talk in the book about the fact how my wife and I have vastly different understandings of, the acting abilities of Leonardo DiCaprio. She thinks he's a total genius and the best thing, in Hollywood history. I think he's a total hack who, quite frankly, I can't believe he could manage to cling to a flipping piece of wood at the end of that movie. You've heard us
You're mad. You're mad. Sorry, I have to stop you there. You're just wrong. Like,
you disagree with me. You like it.
Your wife is right. Your wife is 100%.
Oh, there we go.
Right.
Well, if you heard us talk about DiCaprio, you would go, well, you talk about different people because Andy's talking about this guy who can't act and he's annoying and I just want to throw things at him in every movie, and she thinks he's wonderful and worships the ground he walks on and all this other stuff. But it's clearly the same person. So you can have quite different understandings of somebody and it'd be the same person. But then we take it a little bit further on. We might talk about the US president and we might have a discussion about politics. And, we might talk about who we think is the president of the USA. And you might say you think it's Joe Biden, and I might think it's Joseph Stalin. Quite important difference there, I might suggest, between those two gentlemen as to, and we agree about the office. We agree there's one president, but we disagree profoundly about who that president is. Or we might use a more down-to-earth, a modern example. Maybe as we talk through the show, it turns out that we both got a friend called Justin, who lives in London. And we go, oh, it must be the same friend, obviously, because there's only so many sort of Christians called Justin in London. And it turns out my friend called Justin runs a popular podcast and, is kind of rather short and going bald on top and got a bad sense of humor and all these other things. If Justin Briley does eventually listen to this, it would be quite funny. And turns out on the hand, your friend Justin is a committed atheist. He's 6 foot tall. He loves basketball. He's got a shock of hair. It gets more and more different. And at what point do we conclude that we're talking about vastly different people? And so I've given you there 3 possibilities, I think, for how we can understand difference and similarity. And the debate is, when it comes to the God of the Bible, I just seen the quote that's coming there on the question mark. That's great. Dan Shirkland. Then the question is, where on that spectrum of difference? Are we just a couple of minor differences? Is it actually... Perhaps we agree about the office of, yes, God is the one who's the creator and of all things and ruler of all things, but who that God is vastly different. Or are we actually looking at mistaken identity? And the funny thing is, when I set out engaging with Muslims 25 years ago, I was actually very much of course they're the same. They're just the same with a few minor differences. And then over the years, as I dug more deeply into Quranic theology, realizing there are huge differences here. And actually, as I researched the book, I've been lecturing on this for years, but as I researched the book and really did the deep dive into the Quran, I was like, oh man, these go deeper than I realized. And I think again we get blindsided, and with all due respect to our historical Pope that you mentioned there, I think historically, a lot of Christians firstly tended to assume that Islam was a Christian heresy. You can find a lot of early Christian writers thinking that it's like a Christological heresy, and probably assuming, well, when they talk about God, they obviously mean the same God that we're talking about. And all I'm saying in the book is just stop. When Muslims and Christians talk to one another, let's ask each other, when you say God, who do you mean? Tell me what you mean by God. Tell me about the God that you believe in, and I'll tell you about the God that I believe in, and we'll see where we end up. The book is really an encouragement to just do the hard work of filling in the detail on what we mean by words.
So is that part of the reason? Is this sort of common confusion part of the reason that motivated you to write the book? Because it is quite common. I mean, is that one of the sort of primary motivations?
There's a couple of things. Yeah, good question, Dan. There's a couple of reasons I kind of wrote this beast. I mean, one is exactly that. I actually started the book quite personally, talking about when I grew up in London, a very multicultural city, had lots of friends of different faiths. One of my close friends at high school was a Muslim, and back then, as a teenager, I kind of assumed we were largely the same. I think if you'd asked me, and I'd have gone, well, I go to church. My friend Ahmad goes to the mosque. I read the Bible. He reads the Quran. He has an imam. I have a minister. I follow Jesus. He follows Muhammad. And if you're not careful, you just end up sort of putting these columns side by side, and you assume that it's basically the same thing with interchangeable names. And then it was actually when I began going up to Speaker's Corner in London and doing a lot of dialogues and debates, with Muslim friends there at Speaker's Corner, and going, man, these guys are actually quite different. And I knew they were different because they challenged me. They didn't think it was the same faith. They thought I was demonstrably wrong and had a totally corrupt view of God, and I needed to return to what they saw as the one true faith, which was interesting. So it was really Muslims opened my eyes to that. And then on the other hand, it was as I began doing a lot more sort of public kind of speaking like I do now, discovering, as you said, this belief is kind of everywhere. It's very, very common. I thought, oh gosh, someone needs to sort of talk about this. And then finally, the last piece on writing the book was, I think about 2015. I was in Canada at the time, and a friend in Chicago rang me up to ask me to come do a public talk on this, because a professor at Wheaton College, large, well-known American seminary Bible college, had sort of caused lots of controversy by coming out and saying she thought it was the same God. And my friend KJ said, hey, would you come and do a public lecture in Chicago, explaining why you think it isn't, because he knew my position. And I remember saying to him, how many are you going to get? Is really people interested in this? He went, we might get 100 or so. We actually got about 600. And I opened my eyes to that, man, people are interested. And since then, whenever I've spoken at conferences, particularly where there's like breakouts or, sort of workshops, and I offer this as one of the options, it's always the biggest. People always gravitate kind of to it, because I think it just opens up so many fascinating sort of sub questions, really. So that's the journey that I'm on with it, really.
So is this belief sort of common amongst Muslims as well? So I know a lot of Christians who would hold this belief, but is this quite common among Muslims as well? I mean, because the only group I've encountered who explicitly state this, I think, are the Ahmadiyas, who speak a lot more about us. It's more of a difference about Jesus, but ultimately we're worshipping the same person. So I'm just interested, do you encounter many Muslims who actually think this?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you sort of brought up our Ahmadiyya friends. I've actually, in 25 years of dialoguing with Muslims, Sunni and Shiite and every sort of sect under the sun, I think there is a variation, actually. Sometimes even within the same tradition. I've come across, Sunnis who are by far the biggest sect of Islam, Sunni friends who have lent more towards it's the same God, but you Christians have got a slightly bit of confusion we need to sort you out on. But I've also come across, Muslims who turn around and basically say, you Christians are basically polytheists. The classic, you guys believe in three gods because of the Trinity. And of course, push that only slightly down the track, and you've got Muslims are therefore in the different, and they are the different God category. If they are accusing us Christians of worshipping three gods, then clearly we're not worshipping the same God that they are. So it's interesting, there is that variation within Islam, and I find what fascinating is not many people are aware of that. When I meet Christians who are more at the kind of same God end, who get a bit nervous about this kind of conversation, I sometimes like to lead with, we do know there are many Muslims out there who would agree with me that it's not the same God. Because Christians believe that Jesus belongs to the identity of God. One other thing I just want to stress, that we may get to it again later, but I just want to pop it at this point as well. I just want to be very clear that my answer in the book to the question, I don't believe in one-word answers. But if I was giving a one-word answer, I'm probably about 90% no and 10% yes. Because where I do end up in the book is saying, although the God of the Quran is not the same as the God of the Bible, because I think that's categorically clear, I do meet many Muslims who tell me they believe in a God of love, who are drawn to a relationship with God. I've had many conversations with Muslims who yearn for something more in their relationship with God. Arguably Sufism, the mystical strand of Islam, arose because of that yearning. And I've encountered enough Muslims of that perspective over the years. That leads me as a Christian to somewhere like, say, Acts 17 in the New Testament, where Paul is walking around Athens, looking at all the idols and the statues, comes across the altar to the unknown God, which we've discovered, archaeologists have discovered examples of altars to unknown gods dating from that period in that part of the world. And rather than go off on some great polemic about idolatry, Paul bridges off it. Paul preaches there to the Athenians and says, hey, you're worshiping this God that's unknown. Let me tell you who it is. And with Muslims, I found with some Muslims there's been that right moment where it's the ability to go, look, I agree with you that God is a God of love. I completely agree. I agree with you that we are designed for a relationship with God, not just knowing his commands and obeying him at a distance, never to know anything more. But the God you are describing and being drawn to, I don't think is the God of the Quran, with all due respect. Come on home to the God of the Bible. And of course, being an evangelist, that's the end of the book. I end with this great cry, come on home. If you are someone who is in that position. So I want to be very careful. I'm not a categorical no under every circumstance. There are some Muslims, I think, who really are yearning for the God of the Bible, the real God, not the caricature that the Quran has.
So how far would you go with that? I mean, would you a little bit off top, but would you push that as sort of inclusivism in the sense that you have some Muslims who claim to be worshipping Allah, but are actually really projecting that worship at Christ or Yahweh? Or would that be something you would be uncomfortable with?
I don't think I'd go. I don't think I'd go that far. So much as I would bridge build. I'm a great believer in bridge building, and whoever you're talking to, if you're talking to an atheist or a Hindu or a Muslim or whoever, try and find the common ground and try and look for that place where God is at work in them. That famous quote from Augustine, the early church father, that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. And I think that is a kind of lived experience for many. So you can see where that's going on. And not so much say, oh, you're okay where you are, because that's the kind of universalism piece or the inclusivism. We go, oh, great, well, you're worshipping the God of the Bible, you're fine where you are. Paul doesn't do that to the Athenians. He doesn't go, oh, you're worshipping the God of the Bible. Fantastic. Let's go have an ouzo. He wouldn't do that anyway, he's Jewish. But he basically says, let me tell you who that is. Yeah, and he preaches Christ. And I think that's what we do as Christians, is to go, yeah, you've seen something that's good and right and true. And as Christians, we don't need to be afraid if our Muslim friend, our Hindu friend, our Buddhist friend, our atheist friend has grasped hold of something that is true, because truth is truth is truth is truth. But again, it's drawing them to Jesus. And Os Guinness, one Christian writer and sort of friend over the years, there's a lovely line that Os uses on this, where he says, but there's only one way to God, and that's through Jesus. But there are as many ways to Jesus as there are people who come. And, if somebody finds their way to Jesus, sort of through exploring the mystical end of Islam, that, they read the Quran, they discover Jesus there, they find him fascinating, that motivates them to read the Gospels, find out more, and they finally come to the point of going, oh gosh, he's Lord and Christ. I need to now, bow my knee and become a follower. Fantastic. And I know one or two of those. Who've come in some but in fact, I've got a whole collection of friends who've come to Christ through very strange routes, but they always come to Christ just by different means.
So do you think there's a disconnect then? Because I've seen signs of Muslims on the high street where they're trying to draw in conversation, and oftentimes it's they will very clearly emphasize the Christian Jewish prophets and really hone in on the fact that these guys were actually Muslims. But then
yes.
you've also got the person that you're just talking about, those who are seeking a God of love, seeking a relationship with God, would use the term "I love Allah" or the phrase. So is there a slight disconnect? Do you think those who are sort of on the more polemical apologist front of Islam are utilizing these similarities to get a foot in, and then those who are just searching for God are more inclined to the similarities are more about who God is, whereas the apologist, it's surface level similarities. It's just
it's a great question, Phil, and I think you're probably right, actually, that I think, look, when you encounter somebody who's an honest seeker, it's just fantastic. It's such those are exciting conversations, whether they are, Muslim or Christian or atheist or whatever. In the last few weeks, I've had, 2 or 3 quite, exciting conversations with atheist sort of folks who are on that verge of that seeking position. And it's just a thrill to just see God doing something. And they're not there by a long way, but they're seeing that there's something. And I think there we engage and draw and point people towards Christ as best we can. The Muslim, say, apologist and polemics end of things, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things going on. There's obviously that attempt to kind of, they're trying to build bridges and go, hey, look, these guys were Muslims. And then I think the obvious thing to do, I've always done, is to go, okay, well, can you sort of tell me what the Quran says about the ministry of these folks? The answer is usually virtually nil. So to go, if we want to actually find out much about the life of these folks, we need to go to the Bible and actually use that as a way into the Bible. And I love it when Muslims mention the prophets. They go, well, let's look at them, shall we? Let's go and, if we want to understand the story of, Moses. I mean, the Quran alludes to a few things, but let's get the book of Exodus. Let's do a Bible study and to go, let's subvert the rules of the game. But of course, the example par excellence is Jesus, because I've occasionally come across Muslims using Jesus as the gold standard and wearing T-shirts saying, I love Jesus, or Muslims love Jesus too, kind of thing. And the point I always like to make there, and I've got a whole chapter in the book on this, is that Jesus, the problem for them is that Jesus isn't digestible. So the Quran has kind of borrowed Jesus and stuck him in there, but the problem is he doesn't fit. And so the Jesus of the Quran, he stands head and shoulders above every prophet, despite the fact that the Quran says there's no distinctions between them. His virgin birth. What the heck is going on with that? He's the only prophet in the Quran born of a virgin. There's these 2 great long virgin birth stories in the Quran. The Quran is fascinated by the virgin birth. What is going on there? He's the only prophet in the Quran who's kind of exalted title. He's the Messiah. He's a word from God. He's a spirit from God. He does these amazing miracles that no other Quranic prophet comes anywhere near. And the Quran hints at a role for him on the Day of Judgment that the Hadith then expands. And there's this whole, narrative, this whole eschatology developed in early Islam, which has Jesus coming back at the end of time and, fighting the Antichrist, doing all kinds of spectacular things. I always say to Muslims, what the heck is going on with Jesus? He doesn't fit. He just doesn't fit. It's like my son, who's like 5. He's just about got this right now. Up until about a year or so ago, my son's approach to doing jigsaw puzzles was to take a piece and just pound it hard enough so it kind of fitted in the hole. And it feels like the Quran has done this with Jesus, or to use an analogy I have a lot of fun with in the book, the Quranic Jesus feels rather like somebody's taken, say, Gandalf, Lord of the Rings, and inserted Gandalf into Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen. It just doesn't work. And Jesus just doesn't work in the Quran. He doesn't fit. He's like far too big for his Quranic boots. And then I just say to Muslims, because that's not where he belongs. That's not his natural habitat. You need to come to the Gospels where all of these things make sense. You understand why he does the miracles he does. You understand why he has the titles that he does. You understand why he had the dramatic birth. And of course, we understand, why he's got this incredible role at the end of history, because he isn't a mere prophet. But it's almost like, the Quran has swallowed more than it can chew and choked on Jesus, which is quite a fun image when you think about it.
That's a really fun image. Slamaran in the chat's just been pointing out that there's also talking about the borrowed stories, Jesus creating birds, and then Jesus, even the eternal word in Islam.
Thank you. Absolutely. And all those titles, which don't make sense. If he's supposed to be just a prophet, and the Quran saying we make no distinction between them, all of those kind of pieces. And of course, thank you for mentioning the clay birds, which is, again, that's a whole other issue in Islam, but again, shows us the Quran's tendency to borrow things all over the place, because that story comes from the infancy Gospel of Thomas, dates around sort of 200 AD, something like that, probably come via the Arabic Gospel of the infancy in the 5th kind of century. And again, it's a sort of Christian fairy tale. Christians, a bit like Muslims did in their first few centuries, began telling pious stories, to kind of encourage one another and intrigue one another. And there were lots told about the infancy period of Jesus, because the Gospels have a gap there. The Gospels tell us about his birth, but they don't tell us about his childhood. And so that's where a lot of the kind of sort of more sort of pious fairy tale type stuff was being told. And lo and behold, the Quran picks this stuff up.
That's true. I mean, there is like a clear sort of qualitative difference, isn't there, between Jesus and the other prophets? It's kind of like you said, it's never really engaged with or answered, is it? It's just sort of there. It's sort of blindingly obvious, but is seen to seems to be ignored.
He sort of borrowed and dropped in and undigested. And again, back to Mark Dury's kind of book, using that linguistic model on the Quran. It's a classic example of borrowing. Just as the English word juggernaut doesn't really fit English, it doesn't fit any of the rules of English kind of grammar. It stands out. Reason being, it's been borrowed sort of more or less lock, stock and barrel from Sanskrit and Hindi, and kind of jammed into English when when sort of Brits and India borrowed it and found it a helpful term. And you look at it and go, it stands out. It doesn't fit. It's not an English word. It hasn't come the way that most words in English have come. And you see the same in the Quran. He just stands out. He's been borrowed. It doesn't fit. And even though the author of the Quran, like my 4-year-old son pounding on a jigsaw piece, has desperately banged away and tried to make Jesus fit Islamic theology, he doesn't. And the Quranic reader is left with far more questions than answers, which I say to Muslim friends, if you want those answers, you need to read the Gospels, because there Jesus makes sense and he fits.
Yeah.
So what's to stop a sort of Muslim actually saying that about Jesus that it actually provides a truer, more accurate, more recent revelation of who Jesus is, rather than, I imagine that's the sort of the only option sort of left for you, isn't it? I mean,
well, yeah. I mean, if you can as a Muslim try and go that route, the problem is you still end up with a problem. You still end up with going, well, okay, if it's a more recent revelation, you've still produced this figure in Jesus who just doesn't fit. So if the Quran has come, from heaven directly from God, what was God doing at that moment when that stuff was revealed? It sort of, was he having a distracted moment for some reason? Because it just doesn't work. It doesn't fit the Quranic story. It doesn't fit Quranic theology. In one sense, if you take Jesus out of the Quran and remove all the passages where he's mentioned, you get a much more harmonious view of Quranic prophetology. So again, Jesus looks like the Quranic sort of in the early composition process of the Quran, he was borrowed in with everything else. But again, he wasn't digestible, and he kind of broke the system. I just think that's just such a beautiful metaphor, actually, because I think Jesus is indigestible. I don't think you can cut Jesus down to size. He won't let you in the things that he did and the things that he said. And even though the Quran tries desperately, it fails. But then, of course, so this is perhaps a conversation, for another time, because it opens up a much bigger kind of area of discussion. Then, of course, we just get into the question of going, okay, well, if a Muslim is going to claim the Quran is more recent kind of revelation, then we need to look into does its claims to be a revelation, stand up? And a lot of the more recent work that's been done on how the Quran's come together, that was kind of my PhD, Mark Dury, whose book I've waved a couple of times in the show already. Mark's taken my work and others and developed it further, and others have still. I mean, you've got things like Gabriel Side Reynolds' massive book, the Quran and the Bible, which is you see how thick the puppy is and how many post-it notes on that one. And that's just a really good, pretty much authoritative study of everything the Quran has drawn in from Christianity and Judaism. And Gabriel Side Reynolds is at Notre Dame University, probably one of the Western world's leading Quran scholars, and his expertise is on how the Quran used the former traditions. And you look at all of that and go, it becomes harder and harder to see this thing as falling direct from heaven. And it's interesting, the Clay Birds piece that we just mentioned. There's a gentleman called Shabir Ali, who's one of the Muslim world's most kind of well-known apologists in some ways, based in Canada. And when I was in Toronto, Shabir and I dialogued and debated several times. A pretty nice gentleman, but he's also a pretty fine scholar in some ways. And I think he is interesting because he, in public debates now, has admitted that the Quran contains legends and fairy tales. And Shabir's way to try and deal with this is to say, well, the Quran retells them as teaching examples. In the same way, in a sermon, you might say, well, think about the story of Cinderella and the glass slipper, and we might learn a moral lesson from this. And so the Quran is sort of saying, well, consider the story of Jesus and the clay birds, but it's not claiming it's historical. That's a massive admission that Shabir has publicly made of realizing he can't get around the fact the Quran has borrowed this material and tries to deal with it by the kind of, teaching metaphor idea. And the problem he runs into is that the Quran gives you no contextual clues. The Quran doesn't say, here's a nice story. The Quran introduces all of this material, usually with the same formula in Arabic, where it sort of says, remember when, or consider the story of. Remember when is the most common thing. And it does that for the Claybird stuff, the same as it does for the other stuff. So the poor reader of the Quran, unless they're a critical scholar, has no way of knowing, well, this is legends and this is history and so forth. It rather looks as if the author of the Quran didn't know. That's the most logical conclusion, because all this stuff is jumbled up, together.
It's not an exegetical view, is it? You wouldn't read the Quran and draw that from reading the Quran, would you? It's not. It's definitely not far from self-evident.
Exactly. And if my 8-year-old daughter was to come to me and say, "Hey, Daddy, I've written a little historical essay," because she loves writing, and I read it, and she talks about Elizabeth I and Henry VIII, and then she suddenly talks about Cinderella on the next page, I'm going to have to gently say to her, "Honey, this is a great piece of work, but you just need to know that the first two are historical figures, a queen and a king of England. The other is a fairy tale kind of character, and it's perfectly okay to write about those things, but just make sure in your mind and for your reader you don't confuse people by jamming together Queen Elizabeth I, Henry VIII, and Cinderella." That's sort of what the Quran's done. It's jammed these things together and not helped the reader at all. And that's obviously the obvious conclusion, is the author of the Quran didn't know the difference.
That's a huge conclusion. I'm aware of the time, just as we've only got an hour with you, Andy, but we've got some questions.
10 minutes left, and make it count.
We're going to make them count. So we've got a couple of questions. We've got one lined up that's a little bit of a multi-part one. So focusing on Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. What do you believe about people who recognize there is a creator? And it kind of goes back to the question about inclusivism, and desire to worship that creator. What other concepts do they need to understand?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So thank you for asking that. And I think you're right. Romans points out that there's quite a lot God's put into creation, that you can work a fair amount out. And also for those of us, of course, who love philosophy and apologetics. It's interesting. Before coming onto this show this evening, I was doing this discussion group at a university where a few weeks ago I'd done the events week, and so we had tonight some non-Christian friends and a few members of the CU there. We're discussing together. I was answering a few questions, and there was a question one of the atheists actually in that group asked about why I'm a Christian and what the evidence is, and I started talking about the things that evidence from creation, things like cosmological arguments, all of this kind of stuff. I think actually gives you a God who's a creator, a God who's powerful. You can get all of those things, but it only gets you so far. And of course, Romans only gets you so far. It sort of says there's enough therein for creation for human beings to kind of figure out, if they're reflective, that there is a God, and there's a God before, and probably here we stand, with some pretty good questions to ask about our conduct, actually. But Romans doesn't go the whole way and go, by the way, they could work out who Jesus is and everything else. So Paul doesn't make that argument. And so I think what Paul is doing in the context of Romans is saying there's enough argument evidence there for us to realize that actually we have to hold account for our lives and respond accordingly. But we do need more than that. We need the revelation from nature, but we also need the revelation of Scripture and of God in Christ as well. And so I think that's where I'd sort of edge that, saying, look, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Muslims don't believe in a God who's a creator or any of those things. I'm simply saying that what they've done is they've taken those basic things and they built on top of them, because the Quran does. But the Quran doesn't just say God is a creator. The Quran says a whole range of things about Allah, about God. But the model that builds on top of there, is considerably different from what the Bible builds and what Christians believe. And I suppose, building off Romans 1:20, in the same way we have concerns somebody who says, yeah, I figured out from looking at the majesty of the mountains and the starry skies above and so forth. Yeah, there is a God behind the universe. But I think that God is my cat. We have some questions. We wouldn't go, yeah, that's enough. I think we might go, okay, good. You've figured out there's a God. Great. That you think your cat is that God, I think we need to have a conversation. And I think that also shows, of course, through the history of human history, spirituality has been everywhere. Human beings have pretty much universally, through time and space and history and different cultures, religion has been pretty universal, because I think wired into it, and it's wired into creation. Atheists are a sort of interesting blip historically, an interesting blip, but a blip nonetheless. And I think Romans leads us that way. So I guess that's how I'd begin answering it. Let's not claim too much, but let's not claim too little either.
Yeah, that's helpful. There's another question here from Dean, London Theist. If Muslims believe Muhammad to be the greatest of all the prophets, why do they believe Jesus was sinless, virgin born, etc.? In what way is Muhammad greater?
Oh, wow. Well, there's a whole range of things packed into that absolutely brilliant question. So thank you for asking that. Yeah, well, the first thing is, let's talk about the greatest thing is interesting, because on the one hand, there's a sort of tension in Islam. The Quran does say that there is no distinction between the various prophets that God has sent through history. And Muhammad, according to the Quran, is the end of the line of prophets, beginning with Adam and going right the way down through history and ending with Muhammad. And there's no distinction between them. On the other hand, most Muslims, I think, practically consider Muhammad to be the greatest. They believe he brought the final revelation, the Quran. They believe he was the last of that prophetic line. They believe that all the other prophets were perhaps for their time and place and people. Muhammad was universal. But then, interestingly, when you get into the Hadith, in the centuries after the death of Muhammad and the closing of the Quranic period, you could find plenty of traditions there in the Hadith that do really start bigging Muhammad up. You've got the whole night journey tradition where Muhammad, goes on a kind of, flying donkey from Mecca down there to Jerusalem and, ascends up through the heavens and ends up talking to God himself up in heaven briefly. Definitely that story, one thing that story is designed to do is to make Muhammad elevated above the prophets who are met in the lower heavens. And I think Jesus is there, and Abraham and Moses and so forth. And then lots of traditions develop around Muhammad and his power and things associated with him. And so I think what's interesting is I think Islam struggles to keep Muhammad in his box, fun enough, because there's that sense that, gosh, Jesus is big, so we need to make Muhammad bigger. But the standard answer, I think the most orthodox answer to your question would be, they would say he's the greatest because he brought the final revelation. He was the last one of the prophetic line. But of course, the slight cheeky response there is to go, well, he's not technically the last of the prophetic line, because, of course, Jesus is coming back. According to Islamic tradition, the Quran hints that, very strongly hints that, and early Islamic theology developed that idea with the idea of Muhammad, Jesus coming back in that climactic battle against the Antichrist at the end of time. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. One last thing, actually, I'm rambling slightly because I'm tired. My brain's going. The other thing you could ask, it's a great question to ask Muslims. The other question you can ask them is, in what way in Islam is Jesus great? Because Muslims want to say that Jesus is great. But say, if you just have the Quran, if you don't read the Gospels, Jesus turns up, does all these amazing miracles, so impresses people that his disciples all think that he's God and start worshipping him. The early church begins, and now 2 billion Christians, they worship him because of the way he behaved. Oh, and to compound things, he gets himself arrested, and the Romans want to execute him. So Allah has to do some mysterious miracle, which the Quran alludes to in Surah 4:157, by which he wasn't crucified, but he was crucified. Everybody thought he was. Then they all get confused, think he's risen from the dead, and the Quranic Jesus just causes total confusion. I say to Muslims, how is he great? It'd be better if he never come. If he never come, nobody would worship him. Everybody would presumably be Muslims, because all the other line of prophets would carry on up to Muhammad. Jesus was a total disaster, the Islamic Jesus. What good did he possibly do? He's an incompetent buffoon. The Quran, the Jesus of the Quran, in some ways, but the Jesus of the Gospels, very different.
That's a really interesting point that I've never. Asking them to sort of take that all the way through with what Jesus has done is a really interesting way to deal with it. I think just even the word sinless, I've been finding in my conversations with a Muslim friend, is looking at the Old Testament prophets, for example. The Bible paints them as very human.
Yeah.
They struggle with all sorts of different things. They sin. I mean, Muslims are very clear that David is a prophet. And I asked the other day, actually, so David clearly sinned when he committed adultery, and he's like, no, that could never happen. There's never could happen. And so you're like, but hold on, so you want to hold on to these prophets, but you don't believe any of the stories about them where they come out as clearly human. Are they perfect? And then they say, no, they're not perfect, but they're not sinful. They would never commit adultery. So there's a real confusion. I've not unpicked it yet around sin. Even the phrase sin is very different.
Oh, gee, Phil, I mean, I think you're on something very, very important, actually. I remember first being put on this by a friend of mine who did a lot of work in Pakistan. And one of his methods of evangelism, that he was using at the time, I don't know if he's still doing it, but when he was in Pakistan, he would say he would wander into a tea house and sort of sit down. And he said after a while sitting down, someone would come and join him. And my friend would always go, because we Pakistanis, we're not like you Brits, we're sociable, we talk to strangers. And he said, you'd sit down, and in typical kind of Middle Eastern way, a conversation would begin, and people would stories of families and where you're from and everything. But my friend would say what he would do is after about an hour of the conversation and getting to know his new friend, he would lean across the table suddenly and go, the problem with you, my friend, the problem with you is you're a sinner. That's your problem. And he said, usually what would happen is the person he was talking to would get really irate and go, what do you mean? How dare you? How dare you say I'm a sinner? I'm not a sinner. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. And then my friend would say, what he would do is then after a little round of this, he would say, oh, my word, I have met a Muslim who is even more holy than Muhammad, the prophet himself. Because Muhammad sinned. No, he didn't. Yes, he did. No, he didn't. Yes, he did. And then my friend would open up the hadith, and there are plenty of examples of Muhammad, talking about his sin, praying for prayers of repentance, and so on. And finally, usually what happened is his friend would say, "Well, okay, then all right, maybe I am a sinner." Sorry, a bit louder. I didn't hear that. Okay, maybe I am a sinner. Yes, Allahu Akbar. You're a sinner. I'm a sinner. Muhammad, he's a sinner, as we've just seen from the hadith. So we're all got this problem now. What we need, my friend, we need somebody who is sinless. Can you think of anybody from the prophetic tradition, from the Quran, and basically what he wants them to do, and he plays it beautifully, is he wants them to go, Isa, yes, oh, you're right, yes, he was sinless, and if we're all stuck in this quagmire, sinking in the quicksand, we need somebody who's outside it, who can give us the arm, who can give us the rope, who can pull us out. And according to Islam, as you have said, that is Isa. Maybe we should take a look at the Injil, where his story is told, and then you're in Bible study. So he would do that. And he led many people to faith in Pakistan off that narrative, beginning with sin, pushing them on their sinfulness, getting them defensive, showing them that Muhammad and all the other prophets had this problem of sin, and then only Jesus, uniquely, which raises all kinds of questions. And I think sin's a good place to begin with anybody, because let's be honest, I think the gospel story is until we appreciate we are sinners in need of grace, we're going to get stuck. And again, that's another big point we haven't got time to cover really in the book. Those four worldview questions I go into, the solution is so different. Islam offers advice. Islam will offer you good advice. You're a bit forgetful, Phil, Dan, you kind of mess things up. Here's some more moral commands. Keep a few more of these. You can do better. It's a self-help program is really what Islam offers you. Christianity offers you not self-help, but salvation. Christianity says, no, you can't help yourself. You really, really can't. It's massively more serious than that. However bad you think the problem is, it is infinitely worse. That's the bad news. But the good news is that God has done something about it. He hasn't just sat there in heaven and tossed you a new rule book and gone, keep a few of those, you'll be right. But he's gone, okay, let me actually help you. And that, again, is a sign that I think was a very different God we're dealing about. A God who's like remote and willing to give a few bits of moral advice, or a God who's willing to actually step into history and put a rescue plan into effect that has his own life at the heart of it.
Amen. No, I think that's awesome. Yeah, thank you, Andy. There's so much in that just to take away from that as a reminder of the good news of the gospel. And thank you so much for your time. We're past 9:30, so I realise you've had a busy evening. Slammer, and thank you for sharing Andy's book in the chat. I hope people can click on that link, buy the book. Andy's holding it up there. Hold it one more time. Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? Make sure you get the book, read it. I'm sure it'll bless you, and lots of good stuff in there. Dan, any final words?
I was going to say quickly, is it the sort of book you would give? Who's the target audience? Is it Christians, or is this a book you would give to Muslims as well?
This is that's a brilliant question. And there's actually three audiences very quickly. So firstly, I'd say the first audience are Christians. So I'd say it's a great book to read, to understand your own faith better, to understand the issues, and also understand Islam, because we go into the Quran in some detail, hopefully very accessible, but for Christians, it'd be great to think that through. Second audience would be Muslims, but I also realize that most Muslims are not going to probably pick up a book written by a Christian just off the bat. So it's a great gift for Muslim friends. I recommend for a Christian, if you've got a Muslim friend, get hold of the book, have a read, And if you think it's appropriate for your Muslim friend, because always need to read it first, don't just give it willy-nilly, read it yourself and then pass it on and use it as a discussion starter. I'd say to your Muslim friend, you might not agree with everything, but I hope you might find it interesting. And then maybe afterwards we can sit down for coffee, or if we're still in COVID restrictions, go for a socially distanced walk or something and talk about it. And the third audience, I would say, are our secular friends. I meet so many people who are sort of interested in spirituality and are in this kind of all religions are essentially the same box. And the book is also ideal for that, I think. Anybody who thinks that all religions are essentially the same, that you can pick and choose, it's a great book to give to go, have a look at this. Because Andy doesn't cover all religions, but he does cover 2 of the world's biggest religions. And, and it's great because, one of the cover endorsements is Tom Holland, who's not a Christian.
I like that.
And I love Tom's endorsement, bless him. He says, he says it's an overtly Christian perspective. It's of how to negotiate a truth that is no less self-evident for being one that many prefer to draw a veil across. Christianity and Islam are not remotely the same. And I think it's important. There are lots of people I think it's important to think about that. So people who are kind of thinking through spirituality, but haven't yet, realized that actually there are some choices to be made.
And that is such a strong endorsement, given that Tom's written very extensively on both Islam and Christianity. So, yeah, well done for getting that endorsement in. Andy, any final comments that you'd encourage our listeners to do when engaging with Muslims for the first time?
Exactly. I think thank you, Phil. I think my final word would be to encourage people, for the Christians listening to this, for those of, all faiths and none, let's just learn to talk together. Because one of the things about the book that is very, very important for me in terms of my own journey, and I've got a passion for, is I think because this tendency to try and jam things together and say it's the same God, all religions are the same, is we just stop listening to each other. Because if Muslims believe the same as Christians, we don't need to listen to Muslims because they believe the same as us. And if all religions are essentially the same, we can stick our fingers in our ears and ignore our Hindu and Buddhist friends or our secular friends because everyone's the same. If there are differences, oh man, now we need to listen to each other. And I think there's been so much, heat rather than light generated in a lot of interreligious and debates with Christians and atheists because people haven't listened. So I would say to people listening to this, if you're a Christian, search out a Muslim friend, an atheist friend, and try and find an opportunity for a conversation, not a shouty argument, be a robust conversation, but a conversation. And again, if you're Muslim or atheist or something listening to this, don't pigeonhole people who believe differently to you. Take the opportunity to listen and engage well. It's perfectly okay to disagree, but let's disagree in a way that's robust, in a way that takes the other person's beliefs seriously. And ultimately, that's one of my sort of big takeaways in the book. I think that Islam is radically different to Christianity, and that's okay. Don't be afraid of that. Let Islam be Islam. Let Christianity be Christianity, and let's learn to talk together as we try and work out what's true.
Bro, yeah. Thank you, Andy. Thank you for your time. I'll just close things off, but it's been such a pleasure to talk to you again, and appreciate. It's been a long day for you, so thanks for giving up your time.
Well, it's always great to hang out with you folks, even with Dan wearing that shirt. I mean,
I know it's pretty. It is
pretty about that shirt. I can see it like a kaleidoscope when I close my eyes.
kind of, yeah. It's like when you've looked at the sun.
Pineapple and papaya, and some bananas as well. Papaya.
It's brave. Oh, we've had multiple comments.
I like that. Brave. Brave is that's a good word, isn't it?
Yeah. Anyway, so we're gonna finish up here. So thank you for watching, and I think this is one of the shortest shows we've had. But Andy, it's been so good. There's been so much packed into it that I'll be
full of substance.
Yeah, good amount of sustenance. So we're substance. That's what I meant.
Substance.
So yeah, buy his book. We're going to finish this off before I start, missing other words. And we're going to just thank our patrons who have allowed us to, or enabled us to upgrade our StreamYard account, so we can now. I'm sorry about Dan's shirt. You can watch that in HD these days now. And we've just, not got too many patrons, but we're just very grateful for them. And thanks for those of you in the chat. Thank you for the questions. If you'd like to support us in any way, the biggest ways are, pray for us. We enjoy people praying for us. Share the stream, share it around. Hopefully you find it helpful. Give us feedback in the comments. And if you want to support us financially, that's great. But we do this anyway, so we're having a lot of fun. So thank you again, and have a very good rest of your night, wherever you are. See you later.